Picture a mailbox in 1996. Inside, wedged between a phone bill and a grocery flyer, is a plastic disc with a blue triangle logo on it. 15 hours free, no obligation, just put it in the computer and see what happens. Multiply that disc by roughly 1 billion. That's not an exaggeration, it's an actual estimate from a marketing campaign so aggressive it eventually meant 1 in every 2 CDs manufactured anywhere on Earth had that same logo pressed into it. The company behind that disc would, at its peak, be worth more than General Motors. It would help teach an entire country what the internet even was. And then, within 2 years of reaching the top, it would be attached to the single largest financial write-down in the history of American business. This is the story of AOL, a company built on a simple, almost paradoxical idea. The best way to sell people the internet was to give them as little of it as possible. Before we begin, if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to The Digital Human, where we uncover the stories behind the technologies that built our world and reveal how they're still shaping our future. Let's begin. The company that became AOL didn't start as an internet company. In 1983, it didn't even have a name people would remember. It was called Control Video Corporation, founded by an entrepreneur named Bill von Meister, and it had exactly one product, a service called GameLine, which let owners of the Atari 2600 pay $1 to temporarily download a game over a phone line into a reusable storage module instead of buying a cartridge outright. It was a clever idea about 6 years too early. This wasn't the internet, there was no such public network yet. It was a home modem dialing directly into a central mainframe over an ordinary phone line. And in 1983, that alone was slow, expensive, and rare. GameLine never caught on, and within months, Control Video was already on the edge of bankruptcy. Working there at the time was a marketing consultant named Steve Case, then in his mid-20s. Rather than walk away, Case, along with Jim Kimsey, a former Army Ranger in his mid-40s, brought in as a manufacturing consultant to help save the company, spent nearly 2 years quietly stripping the company down and rebuilding it. In May of 1985, what emerged was a new company, Quantum Computer Services. Quantum's first product, launched in November of 1985, was called Quantum Link, or Q-Link, and it was almost defiantly unglamorous on the surface, built specifically for owners of the Commodore 64, a home computer that was popular but hardly cutting edge. But underneath that unglamorous surface, Q-Link was already a fully formed miniature of everything AOL would later become: email, real-time chat rooms in a section called People Connection, instant messaging, multiplayer games, and file-sharing libraries, all wrapped in custom software that ran directly on the user's own computer, rendering colour menus and graphics instead of the plain scrolling text most online services used at the time. It wasn't a bet on being first, it was a bet on being patient in a niche nobody else wanted yet, and on building, years ahead of schedule, the exact same closed, curated, all-in-one formula that would later define AOL itself. That patience mattered because it set the pattern for everything that followed. Don't chase the most advanced users, chase the ones who haven't logged on yet, and make it easy enough that they will. In 1991, Quantum renamed itself America Online. Steve Case became CEO. The company that would define an era of the internet, before most Americans had any real concept of what the internet meant, had its name. Naming the company was the easy part. In 1993, AOL was still a distant third place in the small, unglamorous dial-up online services market, trailing rivals CompuServe and Prodigy. Then Steve Case hired a marketing executive named Jan Brandt and gave her one job: grow the subscriber base, whatever it takes. Brandt's answer was almost embarrassingly low-tech for a company selling access to cutting-edge technology. Rather than television ads or glossy campaigns, she went back to direct mail. an old, unfashionable tool, and used it to put free trial discs directly into people's hands. The first test, in the spring and summer of 1993, cost $250,000 and mailed out roughly 200,000 discs. The response rate was around 10%. For context, a direct mail campaign that pulls 2 or 3% is considered a success. 10% wasn't just good. It told the company it had found a formula worth scaling. So Brandt scaled it. Discs went into magazines. Discs went into Blockbuster stores and Barnes & Noble. Discs came bundled with banks, with airlines, even reportedly tucked into packages of frozen steaks. What looked, from the outside, like a blunt force blizzard of plastic was, underneath, closely measured. AOL was reportedly running around 2,000 different tests a year, tracking the profitability of every single mailing and adjusting based on the data. By 1996, AOL had roughly 8 million subscribers. At the campaign's peak, the company was signing up a new subscriber roughly every 6 seconds. And by some accounts, from people who ran the program, half of all the compact discs manufactured anywhere in the world during that stretch carried the AOL logo. The dial-up handshake sound, the mailbox icon, the phrase, "You've got mail," these weren't just interface details. They were the sound and shorthand of an entire country's first experience of being online. And AOL had engineered its way into being the default version of that experience for tens of millions of households. The subscriber count says it all. AOL had roughly 200,000 subscribers in 1993, when it first began offering internet access at all. That became 1 million by 1994, 4 million by 1995, 8 million by 1996. By 1999, it had crossed 10 million, and by the year 2000, boosted by acquiring rival CompuServe along the way, AOL had roughly 23 million subscribers, pulling in more than $4 billion a year in subscription fees alone. A company that had been fighting for third place in 1993 was, within 7 years, the largest online service in the world. But growth that fast has a way of outrunning the infrastructure built to support it. And in AOL's case, that collision played out in headlines and courtrooms, not just server rooms. Through the mid-1990s, AOL billed by the hour. $9.95 a month bought 5 hours, and every hour after that cost extra. It was a model that made sense for a niche service, but by late 1996, competitors, including Microsoft's MSN, were moving to flat-rate unlimited access for $19.95 a month. And AOL had no real choice but to match it. On December 1st, 1996, AOL switched its subscriber base over to unlimited access. The result was immediate, and not in the way the company had hoped. Freed from the meter running in the background, AOL members roughly tripled their average time online. Usage jumped from around 7 hours a month to over 20. Daily email volume climbed from roughly 5 million messages to more than 13 million within months. And AOL's network, built for an hourly billing world where people logged off quickly, simply couldn't handle an unlimited access world where people stayed on for hours instead. The busy signal became the defining AOL experience of early 1997. Subscribers dialing in at night routinely got nothing but a fast, busy tone, sometimes for hours at a stretch. By January, attorneys general in at least 5 states were investigating consumer complaints, and multiple class action lawsuits had been filed, accusing AOL of selling unlimited access it couldn't actually deliver. Steve Case himself posted an apology directly to members, asking them, in effect, to be patient while the company scrambled to add server capacity. comparing the situation to waiting politely for a shared phone booth. AOL ultimately reached a formal agreement with roughly 40 state attorneys general, promising refunds, curbing its unlimited advertising claims, and spending heavily to expand its network. But the episode became a preview of a recurring theme. The same system that felt safe and simple at one size started falling apart at the next. AOL was never really selling the internet, it was selling a curated substitute for it. Instead of typing a web address, AOL users typed a keyword, a short, brand-controlled term that took them to a specific AOL-approved destination inside AOL's own system. Instead of the open, chaotic web, there were AOL chat rooms, AOL forums, AOL content partnerships, a controlled environment designed to feel safe and simple for people who had never used the internet before. This was a deliberate design choice, and it made sense for the moment. Most new users in the early to mid-1990s weren't looking for the wide-open web. They wanted something that felt manageable, closed, and hard to get lost in. AOL built exactly that, a walled garden with AOL as the gatekeeper deciding what grew inside it. For years, this was a massive advantage. It made AOL sticky. It made the service feel less like raw infrastructure and more like a destination, a place, not just a pipe. In 1992, AOL had gone public, becoming the first internet company to do so, and by the back half of the decade, it had become, for a huge share of Americans, a synonym for the internet itself. But a walled garden only works as long as the walls are worth staying inside. And the taller AOL built those walls, the more exposed it would eventually be to whatever came next, including, in one strange case, a crack that came from inside AOL's own engineering team. Around 1994, an AOL engineer named Barry Appelman, a former IBM programmer who had worked on some of the earliest internet networking standards, noticed something useful buried in how AOL's system worked. It could tell, in real time, when a specific user was logged on. Appelman built a small tool, without telling AOL's management, that let a user see which of their friends were currently online. He called it, informally, the buddy list. By 1997, Appelman, working with fellow engineers Eric Bosco and Jerry Harris, had extended that idea into something bigger, a free, standalone instant messaging program developed quietly some nights on sleeping bags in the office without official sign-off. It shipped in May of 1997 as AOL Instant Messenger, or AIM. AOL's own executives, according to multiple accounts from the engineers involved, were not pleased. AIM was free, no subscription, no hourly fee, which cut directly against a business built entirely on charging for access. Reports from the team describe AOL leadership at one point wanting to kill the project entirely and considering firing at least one of the people who built it, before eventually being talked into letting it continue once its popularity became obvious. That popularity turned out to be enormous. By 2001, AIM had roughly 36 million active users, and by the mid-2000s, it accounted for roughly half of the entire online instant messaging market in the United States. It gave the culture screen names, away messages, and buddy lists years before Facebook or Twitter existed. Twitter's own co-founder has said the away message was part of what inspired his platform. And yet AIM itself generated close to zero direct revenue, which meant the product, with arguably the deepest cultural footprint of anything AOL ever built, was also the one thing inside the walled garden that AOL's own business model was never designed to support. It points to something bigger about how AOL operated. AOL's instinct at the executive level was always to keep things controlled, priced, and contained. Its most beloved and enduring product existed because a handful of engineers quietly ignored that instinct. AIM would eventually be shut down in December of 2017, after fading for years against smartphone texting and Facebook Messenger. a slow ending for something that had once defined how an entire generation talked to each other online. By the end of the 1990s, AOL wasn't just successful, it was arguably overvalued, riding the broader dot-com bubble to a stock price that had tripled in 18 months. Some of that growth-era stability came from executives like Bob Pittman, the former MTV co-founder who joined AOL in 1996 to run its consumer operations and push the service toward becoming a genuine mass-market brand rather than a niche tech product. And on January 10, 2000, Steve Case and Time Warner CEO Gerald Levin stood together to announce what was, at the time, the largest corporate merger in history. A deal reported to be worth somewhere between $164 and $182 billion, depending on how you measure it. The pitch was convergence. AOL brought the internet audience and the new media story. Time Warner brought HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers, a library of film and television, and one of the country's largest cable systems. Combine them, the argument went, and you'd get the first fully integrated internet and media company on Earth. It didn't work that way. CNN wasn't eager to hand AOL preferential access to its content. Warner Music resisted digital distribution plans that threatened its own business. The cable division was in no rush to bundle broadband with a dial-up brand it viewed as already fading. Time Warner executives, who ran real, cash-generating businesses, reportedly resented being formally acquired by what they saw as an inflated internet upstart, even though, technically, AOL was the one buying Time Warner. And underneath the culture clash was a harder problem. Broadband internet was arriving, and it didn't need AOL's walled garden at all. Search engines like Google were arriving too, making AOL's curated keywords and approved destinations look quaint next to a tool that could find anything on the open web in a fraction of a second. And AOL had even helped, quietly making Google its own search partner starting in 1999. The entire premise that had made AOL dominant, control the on-ramp, curate the experience, was becoming irrelevant on two fronts at once: how people got online and how they found anything once they were there. The math caught up in 2002. Under new accounting rules that required companies to test the goodwill on their books, essentially the premium they'd paid above the hard value of what they acquired, AOL Time Warner ran the numbers on its own merger and produced a write-down of roughly $99 billion. It remains, to this day, one of the largest such write-downs in corporate history. It's worth being precise about what that number actually represents, because it's often misunderstood. It wasn't $99 billion in cash lost in a single bad quarter. It was an admission, a couple of years after the fact, that the price paid for Time Warner, priced largely in AOL's own wildly inflated stock, had been built on a valuation that no longer existed. The dot-com bubble had already popped. The write-down was the accounting catching up to a fact that had been true since roughly 2001. The corporate fallout matched the number. AOL Time Warner reported a net loss for 2002 of roughly $98.7 billion. At the time, the largest annual loss ever reported by a US company. Steve Case was pushed out as chairman in 2003, and the company quietly reverted to the name Time Warner Inc., as if trying to erase the AOL half of its own name from the record. The unwinding took most of a decade. Time Warner spun off its cable division in 2009, and in December of that same year spun off AOL itself, sending it back out into the world as an independent company for the first time since the merger. In 2015, Verizon bought AOL outright for $4.4 billion, a fraction of what AOL had once been worth on paper. 2 years later, Verizon bought Yahoo as well, folding both fading internet-era brands into a single media division. It didn't go well for Verizon either. The telecom giant wrote down roughly half the value of both brands within a few years, and in 2021 sold the combined Yahoo and AOL business to the private equity firm Apollo Global Management for about $5 billion, with Verizon keeping a small 10% stake for itself. In late 2025, Apollo's Yahoo began negotiating to sell AOL again, this time to Bending Spoons, an Italian technology company known for buying and reviving older digital brands. That sale, valued at somewhere between $1.4 and $1.5 billion, closed in early 2026. AOL, the company that once taught an entire nation how to log onto the internet, exists as a legacy email and web portal brand, owned by a company most of its original users have never heard of, generating steady but modest advertising revenue as one small asset in someone else's much larger portfolio. None of this makes AOL a failure, exactly. It made dial-up internet a mass-market product a decade before most of its rivals figured out how. It turned an obscure Commodore 64 bulletin board into the dominant online brand in America. It got there by mailing out something close to 1 billion plastic discs and treating each one as a data point. But the same instinct that built the empire, wall off the experience, control the on-ramp, keep the garden small and safe, was never built to survive an internet that eventually became open, fast, and free of gatekeepers. AOL didn't lose to a single competitor. It lost to the version of the internet it had spent over a decade quietly training people not to need. This channel is about systems. The ones that were built decades ago and still run everything. The ones being built right now that nobody is watching closely enough. We will cover them, one at a time, the same way we covered this one. Thank you for watching.